This week the topic is how to interpret the treaties. I think it's most difficult topic and probably very essential topic that we have to cover throughout this treaty law class. First of all, I'd like to invite you to think about this very famous statement made by famous international law scholar. The problem of treaty interpretation is one of ascertaining the logic inherent in the treaty and pretending that this is what the parties desired. Usually the treaty lasts over generations, right? So the one who interprets a treaty will not, in most cases, be the one who actually negotiated and signed the treaty. So it would be almost impossible or extremely difficult for a interpreter to know genuine intention of the parties who negotiated and signed the treaty. So only viable way would be to ascertain certain logical understanding or story inherent in the treaty itself and legally presume that it is what the parties desired. So as long as such logical understanding is reasonable and workable enough, it does not matter even if it is different from genuine intention that might be found with much effort. In conducting such a process of logical presumption, at least three factors need to be taken into account to reach a reasonable interpretation of treaties. First of all, the text of the treaty and its ordinary meaning gives you general information about the treaty, not only because such information is based on almost really objective criteria in the society, I mean the common uses of language, right? But also because the text it is, after all, the authentic expression of intentions of the parties. Although text itself gives you such helpful information, it could be vague and sometimes have many meanings. So effort to find what were true intentions of parties who signed the treaty would also be a necessary element in your treaty interpretation process. Also, making a treaty to which sovereignties voluntarily decided to subject itself is always based on certain purpose that is pretty strong enough and very much apparent. So, object and purpose of a treaty gives you helpful guidance for interpretation. All of these three factors should play a role in interpreting a treaty, but the question is which factor should be given more weight. Textual approach emphasizes the primacy of the text. So as soon as parties' intention is expressed in a written language, the language itself becomes a independent life. Thus, any interpretation effort should give primary weight to figure out what objective meaning of such expressions, not the subjective intentions had by the parties. On the contrary, those people who give more weight to the intentions of the parties require you to invest more time and energy to find out what was genuine intentions of the parties, and any textual interpretation cannot go beyond such intention. So to this kind of school of thought, sovereignties may not be bound by any unintended commitment. They spend much effort to study preparatory works of a treaty and any hint or information about intentions in such works. On the other hand, there are some people who really gives more weight to the object and purpose of the treaty, who think that they have to give more weight to purpose factor in order to make the treaty more effective. So how to make a treaty more effective tool to govern international relations is their primary concerns. This kind of way of thought is called teleological approach in treaty interpretations. And there's quite famous Latin saying ut res legis valet quam perit here. So that the thing may rather have effect than be destroyed. So in interpreting English, it's very important to try to construe a law in a way to make sense rather than void it. So how to make a treaty as functional as possible so that we interpret the treaty in a more effective way based on overarching purpose or objective that the treaty drafters fulfilled with in various ways. That is really their major concern. If you take a look at Vienna Convention of Law Treaty, Article 31, this convention has a general title of General Rule of Interpretation. So they indicate such element as good faith here, good faith, and ordinary meaning and context, object and purpose as a really crucial part of interpreting treaty as a general rule of interpretation. And paragraph 4, they indicate the element of intention here, but this intention can be referred to only if a special meaning need to be given to a term after you can establish that the parties so intended. So drafters of Vienna Convention considered ordinary meaning and context and object and purpose as really crucial element of general rule of interpretation, and intention as a quite special rule of interpretation, not the general interpretation. And Article 32 says interpreter may take a look at the preparatory work and circumstances of the conclusion of treaty as a supplementary means. So only if any interpretation of treaty according to general rule of interpretation may lead the meaning ambiguous or obscure, or leads to a result which is manifestly absurd or unreasonable, then interpreter may apply the supplementary means of interpretation such as preparatory work and circumstances of conclusion. So as you can see from this slide, majority of modern international law scholars and writers, according to IAC commentary, emphasize the primacy of the text as the basis for the interpretation of treaty, while at the same time giving a certain place to intrinsic evidence of the intentions of the parties and to the object and purpose of the treaty as a means of interpretation. So this kind of a view of the IAC was reflected in the Vienna Convention. Of course, teleological factors are reflected in such places that requires that a treaty shall be interpreted in good faith, in accordance with ordinary meaning, to be given into its terms in context of the treaty, and in light of object and purpose. So, primarily, they relied upon the textual approach, and they combined that approach with the teleological approach in the same vein here. Whereas intention can be only referred to as a supplementary means of interpretation. So if general rule of interpretation leads to really obscure meaning or non-manifest meaning, then you can only rely upon intention by the parties by looking at preparatory work and circumstances. So you can say there's kind of hierarchy of rules of interpretation in the Vienna Convention. First, priority goes to textual combined by teleological approach, and the next step goes to intention-based approach. So definitely there's a hierarchy in applying the rules of interpretation. So this is quite simple, by succinct summary of Vienna Convention rule of treaty approach. In contrast, there have been quite strong kind of opposition to this Vienna Convention approach, and that opposition approach is called New Haven School approach. So they, Yale University and international law scholars like McDougall in the Yale have been arguing that treaty must be viewed as a continuing process of communication rather than static written concessions. So it really means kind of dynamic process of communication among sovereignties and collaboration between the parties. So you cannot understand the meaning of the treaty in static way. It must be more dynamic way. So examining context in a much broader sense, they try to examine the context in much broader sense, and they try to find some shared expectations of commitment, and they even take into account community values in interpreting treaties. So they are opposing to pretty much textual-based approach on the Vienna Convention, and they try to look at more background circumstances of concluding treaty and maintaining treaty subsequently, and what kind of community value can we inject in the process of interpreting treaty in a quite intertemporal way. So they hate textual interpretation approach. Of course, even though we have this Vienna Convention approach as a primary rule of interpretation currently, because the Vienna Convention acquired already the status of customary rule of law in international society. But as ILC members honestly acknowledged when they drafted the Vienna Convention rule of law of interpretation, Commission confined itself to trying to isolate and codify the comparatively few general principles which appear to constitute general rules for the interpretation of treaties. So they really admit that there were not enough principles of interpretation of treaty at the time, so they only incorporated only few general principles. So we can say still we have quite large room to find out more principle of interpretation of treaty, and probably in the future we can amend the Vienna Convention of Treaty Article 31 and 32 to incorporate more rules of interpretations. On top of that, general principle of interpretation, very interesting concept of evolutionary treaty interpretation was suggested by ICJ decision. I think many decisions, but particularly 2009 Costa Rica versus Nicaragua case gives a lot of elucidation for this approach. So basic question, what ILC is asking here is, what if the meaning of treaty term evolves? So which meaning should be adopted to interpret? Old meaning or new meaning that was evolved from old meaning? So the fact of this case is that Costa Rica and Nicaragua made an agreement that Nicaragua gives the Costa Rica a perpetual right of free navigation in a river flowing between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. But the condition of such provision of right was made on the condition that navigation is made con-object towards the commercial. So in interpreting English, for the purpose of commerce, right? So if Costa Rica navigate that particular river for the purpose of commerce, then Nicaragua agreed to give perpetual right of free navigation. That is the agreement. Whether we have to interpret this Spanish, right, in English and to the meaning that for the purpose of commerce, or with the article of commerce, that was one issue of dispute between two countries. Because in Spanish, this word can mean both. So is it really for the purpose of commerce or with the articles of commerce? Nicaragua argued this means with the articles of commerce, because here article means goods, right? So only when Costa Rican vessels carry articles for sale and navigate that river, then Nicaragua is obliged to give free passage right. That's Nicaraguan interpretation. So trading goods is only the subject matter of the treaty, and trading services is not agreed yet. So Nicaragua has the right to prohibit any navigation ship of Costa Rica which engages in trading service like tourism service, right? On the other hand, Costa Rican side interpreted this language meaning for the purpose of commerce. So, trading goods is also commerce, and trading services is also commerce. So no matter whether we engage in trading goods or trading services, we have the right to navigate through that river. That's Costa Rican interpretation. And Nicaraguan argument, alternative argument goes, even we accept that this phrase means for the purpose of commerce, but we cannot recognize Costa Rican right to navigate when the vessel is engaging in trading services, because the word commerce in old days when the treaty was made meant only trading goods, because there was no substantial activity of trading services in those days. Usually when they say commercial right is guaranteed, that means trading goods right was only guaranteed. Whereas these days, right, commerce usually means not only trading goods but also trading services, right? So whether we interpret the word commerce in contemporary sense or in the sense that was recognized when the treaty was concluded, that was at issue in this case. According to Nicaraguan contention, even though it was 1858, but passengers were already being transported on some region, and even that this was essentially profitable activity, but this activity did not fall within the scope of what was commonly called commerce at the time. So as for the transport of tourists, there were no such activity at the time in the area in question. So we cannot recognize Costa Rican right of travel their vessel through the river when they engage in trading services. ICJ made a very interesting ruling. They said we have to interpret the word treaty term in contemporaneous way. So the meaning that must prevail is the meaning with meaning that was had when the treaty was concluded. So because since doing so can shed light on the parties' common intention, but that's general rule. But when the parties to a treaty used certain generic term such as commerce, as here, then we can understand the parties really presumed to have intended those terms to have an evolving meaning. So they could have easily understood that such generic term might be easily evolved into a new meaning in the future. So despite that possibility, they still use the generic term. That means they really implied or tacitly recognized that evolving meaning could be prevailing in interpreting the such term between the parties. So when generic term was used in the treaty, then parties must be presumed, as a general rule, to have intended those terms to have an evolving meaning. That is to be holding by the ICJ in this case. Particularly particularly when the treaty is using a term referring to a class of activity, or the treaty has a duration of unlimited years. So treaty is really permanent treaty, and treaty is intended to create a legal regime. Then you have to interpret the generic term as evolving meaning, not the static meaning. That's the ICJ decision. Another interesting tribunal decision was made with regard to interpretation of the word alcoholics. This case was made by European Court of Human Rights, and we told Lita versus Poland case in 1988. If you take a look at the European Human Rights Convention, Article 5, 1E, even though everyone has the right to liberty and security, right? But this convention recognizes several exceptions, and one of which is the case where the government, European government, make a lawful detention persons, and such persons include alcoholics here. Alcoholics. So at the time, we told Lita was half-blind person. He could not even properly walk because of he has some handicap situation. But he visited some post office in Poland, and he found out that his mailbox was opened and left open, and he was so surprised and yelled at the post office staff that, "Oh, who opened my post office box?" And he strongly, protested against, some lack of security measure by the post office. And post office staff, just called the police and let the police arrest him. And the police arrested the person and put him into temporary detention was that he looked like a drunken person. So according to Polish law at the time, any drunken person can be put into temporary detention for 48 hours period. But this person thought it's so unfair, so he brought this case to European Human Rights Court Tribunal after exhausting domestic remedy. And at the issue was how to interpret this exception clause on the European Human Rights Convention, Article 5. Because withdrawal at the time was not alcoholic, but he was merely drunken person, right? So can the word alcoholic include drunken person, or it can only include a person who really alcoholic, right? Habitually drunken person. Right? So in interpreting this word, European Human Rights Court took a look at a lot of new circumstances that was evolved since conclusion of this treaty. These days, many people are really becoming alcoholic, and they drink a lot, and that makes bad influence on the minors, and that create a lot of social problems. So we have to take on account of that new situation and try to interpret the word alcoholics. So in a sense, this case also recognized the concept of evolving meaning of treaty term according to European standard. And another interest treaty provision, which is Article 7 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right? If you take a look at that provision article, there's a general prohibition of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment of human being, right? So how do we interpret the word cruel? Probably in 19th century, right? Subjecting minors to death penalty was not cruel punishment, right? Because many countries actually did that, and they did not consider such punishment for minors was not really cruel punishment. And they executed a criminal by hanging even in public square, right? So such execution in public square was not really cruel punishment in those days. But now, definitely, death penalty for minors and hanging in public square will be considered as really cruel punishment. So even though we have same term of cruel, but as time goes by, the meaning could evolve to mean something else than was originally intended to mean in old days. Of course, one may say that actually that was not really evolution of the meaning of the term itself. So when you say the cruel, uh, then certain status of cruelty, right, was had in ordinary reasonable person, uh, and that mindset does not change over time at all. But scope of uh, meaning, I mean, scope of cruelty might change. So in those days, punishment minors through the death penalty was not included into cruel activity, but these days, definitely that is one of the kind of cruelty. So meaning does not change, but what actually changes is not the meaning, but scope of the meaning. Uh, uh, and some might say what actually changes the application of treaty term, not the meaning itself. Uh, but anyway, there's such interesting debate. But anyway, whether we have to reflect some evolution of meaning or simple application or scope of meaning, whatever it is, or do we have to really stick to original meaning and scope of meaning uh, when the treaty was actually concluded? That was an interesting debate, and ICJ started to uh, take account of more evolutionary approach of interpretation of treaty term. That's quite interesting trend we have to pay attention to. Anyway, with this basic understanding, now at the second segment, we will try to interpret Article 3 of GATT uh, by applying the general principle of interpretation and supplementary principle interpretation, and possibly if we can apply the evolutionary meaning principle to that provision, then why don't we apply such principle as well and try to come up right reasonable and contemporary understanding of national treatment of trading goods of WTO agreement. We'll take a break. Okay.